Tonight, we're very happy to have Dr. Chris Neill, Senior Scientist of the Woods Hole Research Center, now called Woodwell Climate Research Center, or at least the part that he is a part of. And the title of his talk is Plant Responses and Ecosystem Resilience Following Restoration of Former Cranberry Bogs. So it's going to be an interesting topic. I've seen some of Chris's work in the field. I'm going to show you just a couple slides in a sec, but I just want to say, coming from the only other state where cranberry is a really big value production in agriculture, that being Wisconsin, I've been fascinated to see the really extensive cranberry bogs here in Massachusetts and how they managed to squeeze themselves into a much more dense population here. And Chris is probably going to talk about market influences of Wisconsin and the overproduction, perhaps, of cranberries as a factor in the decline of the bogs here. I wanted to just say that Chris is not a guy who sits inside all the time looking at papers and working on statistics and writing his next paper. He's a guy that gets out in the field. This is a picture from November of 2020 when we went out with some other people on an absolutely drenching day. It wasn't raining at that particular moment, but most of the rest of the day it did. And this is one of the sites in Freetown where it's at the edge of a bog that will be restored. And we've been talking about some of these sort of adjacent cranberry bog adjacent plants that can be brought into the mix for the restoration. I'm sure Chris will talk about that. And then over on your, let's see, the screen right, this was the day just, a couple months ago on the Childs River, a new restoration where Chris was out in the blazing sun and the dew point was about 74 degrees. We were all sweating like crazy and I was just there 30 minutes, but he'd been out there the whole day doing quadrats, taking plant quadrats with his couple of grad students. So he's a man for all seasons and a good man in the field as well as a great researcher. So welcome everyone. Please welcome Dr. Chris Neill.
Thank you very much. I'm thrilled to be here. I love talking about this work. And I think I want to start by just acknowledging some other folks. I'm one of a team of people who's working on this issue of cranberry bog restoration and how it can help us not only augment biodiversity in the state of Massachusetts in the Northeast, but also create ecosystems that are resilient to climate change. And some of those people are the folks who help me generate these data, and those include Anastasia Pulak, who works with me at Woodwell, Sarah Kleonsky, who's a PhD student at UConn now and is making plant work and restoration sites as part of her PhD, but also some former students and workers with me, Haley Miller, Ben Hoekstra, and then Pam Poloni and Don Schall, botanists on the Cape are wonderful. They come out, they work with us in the herbarium and the field. And then Linda Deegan, who works with me closely at Woodwell, has contributed a lot of work on more on the aquatic side of these restorations. And then there's sort of two other folks that I want to acknowledge as big parts of this whole effort that I'm going to talk about. And one is Gloriana Davenport, and Gloriana and her husband Evan Schulman were the former owners of the Tidmarsh Farms cranberry operation, which was a big operation in the Manomet section of Plymouth, and that is now this absolutely marvelous Tidmarsh Sanctuary owned by Mass Audubon. And if you haven't been there, that's a great place to get up close and personal with these restorations. That was the second restoration that was ever done. And then the other person who kind of serves as the spiritual leader, I think, and intellectual spark plug for a lot of this work is Alex Hackman, who works for Mass DER, Division of Ecological Restoration in Mass Wildlife. And he now leads this cranberry program, and it's expanding. He's the leader of a big NRCS grant that's really enabling them to take this work to the next level. So I'm going to talk about some of the pieces that I've done that are more plant associated, and then I'll talk about ecosystem resilience as part of the overall mission of these restorations, which I think is critical. All right, I want to provide some context. that won't surprise any one of you that we are in the midst of a sort of a human-caused extinction crisis. This just the other day in the New York Times, 20 species that we sort of know are gone were declared officially gone, but there are 1 million more species at risk, on the planet. Many in this country that are going to go by the wayside if we don't take more active action to preserve habitat. And this is this crazy graphic that the Cornell Lab of Ornithology did when when Rosenberg published his paper on the loss of billions of birds in North America. But this highlight here just says there are a number of threats. Habitat loss, number one, associated with the intensification of agriculture, disturbance, direct mortality, all exacerbated by climate change. And I kind of want to talk about how those things have come together in Massachusetts and around this issue of restoration of former agriculture in cranberries. And and I'm going to talk about it as a very bright spot in a world that's turning pretty dark. But I think for that reason, it's a shining example of what we can do to address this crisis. The other context for this, I think, is important. Is you hear a lot these days about natural climate solutions as part of our societal way that we can address climate change. And some of these things you hear are quite technical. There's a lot of technical work going on. Natural climate solutions really boil down to managing land on Earth for both carbon sequestration and for the co-benefits that come with preserving natural spaces. And those co-benefits, include cleaning up water, providing habitat, supporting biodiversity, providing resilience in the face of upcoming extreme events. And this, what I have this highlighted, this report at the bottom. We need to shut off emissions for sure, but managing natural spaces, especially natural spaces that can store a lot of carbon and provide a lot of co-benefits, are a key part of the solution. And we could soak up about 1/5 of emissions, current emissions, with natural climate solutions. If we ever want to get to sort of net zero, we need the Earth to work with us and not just shut off emissions. This report was something I actually contributed to, and it was like many other of these reports. But what was interesting is we highlighted that where can you store the most carbon? Where can you store the most carbon the quickest and have the most co-benefits? Well, the answer is pretty obvious. It's in regrowing forests and in restoring wetlands, where you not only store carbon above ground in wetland vegetation, especially if they're forested wetlands, but you sock away carbon below ground in soils in peat. And so I'll come back to this point, but I want to talk about these restoration projects in that context ultimately. And I think it's key. I'm going around every talk I have to say, we need to invest in nature rather than just bridges and roads and infrastructure. And I love the title to this. This was Carl Safina and Paul Greenberg in the New York Times earlier this year, that we don't need more life-crushing steel and concrete. So yes, we need an infrastructure package that needs to pass Congress, but we also need big, ambitious infrastructure projects that emphasize natural climate solutions and rebuilding and restoring natural systems. All right. Okay, the other piece of context is what Bob just mentioned, right? Cranberries now, like almost all agricultural products, are a global commodity. So what's driving what's going on in Massachusetts with cranberry bogs is not just a function of what's happening in southeastern Mass, where all these cranberry bogs are, but it's global. And this was actually, I thought it was very funny, very interesting, because cranberries are, cover such a small area compared with some of the other crops. But the New York Times a few years ago highlighted cranberries as this global commodity and had this big series on intensification of agriculture. And what were the color, the graphics? They're pictures of cranberry bogs. Of course, everybody loves pictures of cranberry bogs. But this is an operation in Wisconsin, giant bogs, all squared off, very modern, giant facilities that accept berries and sort of put them into a global commodity market. Right? And those changes, that globalization of agriculture is hitting home and playing out in a major way in southeastern Mass. And so I want to talk about that as to set the stage for what we're doing in terms of restoration. This is the bog in southeastern Mass. But here's the trend Bob is talking about. So, if you go back to the 60s and 70s, Massachusetts was the global leader in cranberry production. But in sometime in the late 90s, Wisconsin passed Massachusetts as the leading producer in terms of acres and in terms of sort of barrels, of the way cranberries are measured in 100-pound barrels. So what's been evident is that Wisconsin has invested in open space, proper conditions, sandy soils, access to water, cold winters, all the conditions required for growing cranberries. Wisconsin expanded production dramatically, while Massachusetts production remained pretty static. Same number of acres in production over decades in Massachusetts. And the production really ramped up in Wisconsin, and the production has increased only marginally in Massachusetts. And the reason for this is Massachusetts is a historic and older industry. Many of the bogs have been there for a long time. They are planted with lower yielding, older varieties. All this new production in Wisconsin is very modern, with varieties that yield 2, 3, or often 4-fold the berries per acre as Massachusetts bogs. So that led to this kind of historical, sort of oscillation of prices, but now we're in kind of a stagnation over here on the right. This was the history of price of Massachusetts, and of course, Massachusetts and Wisconsin price is virtually the same because it's a global commodity. The ups and downs, every time they discover a new cranberry product, juice, craisins, exports to China and other places, production, sort of the price goes up. But now, what's the next big cranberry product? Nobody really knows. So then we're over here. Prices are low, and farmers are having a real hard time in Massachusetts making money because they're growing less per acre, and they're sort of stuck with all this old agricultural infrastructure in terms of the structure of the bogs, right? And that old infrastructure sort of looks like this. Some of these bogs actually have rivers running through them. This is a picture of Neill River in Plymouth before a restoration experiment. But they, to flood the bog, you actually block up the river and you hold water and flood the bog. Well, you have conflicts with fish. It limits the pesticides you can use. So these are kind of antiquated bog types that are harder to manage, and none of these are planted with the new varieties, right? You have other bogs that are sort of the traditional Massachusetts wetland bogs. They're often odd shaped. They're made on former wetlands. They have ditches around the edges. Most of these also were planted with the traditional varieties. Then you have a smaller number of bog acres, which are these more modern Wisconsin-style bogs, which are called upland bogs, which are sort of squared off, planted with the new cultivars. And this is a grower. I attended one of the growers' meetings a couple of years ago. He was showing off this newly renovated modern upland bog with PVC drains underneath it. Everything absolutely laser leveled. This is how you grow cranberries today. Just to show you sort of how these sit in the landscape, this is just an old topo map of the southern part of Plymouth. And this is the current sort of Google Earth image. Here's Federal Pond here, this pond. This was a big swamp down here in this region over here at Clear Pond. This was all traditional Massachusetts style bogs, odd shapes nestled into the swamp, pumping water from a pond. These are up here where it was upland. These were made from upland. They're sealed at the bottom so they hold water. They're squared off so you can spray with a boom from a tractor driving up one side, down the other. Very efficient, needs less manpower to run. And so Massachusetts now is this mix of bog types, right? And in 2016, the cranberry industry did a self-study. It was led by the industry itself, and they, to address this kind of looming and ongoing crisis of prices, they came to the following conclusion. So Massachusetts today, with the largest number of commodity producers receiving below cost of production, is in dire straits. So the industry is hurting. They have the lowest yields per acre of the major growing regions, mainly compared to Wisconsin, because more bogs are in these acres planted to lower yielding varieties. What this report concluded was new and different. And it said, we have to figure out green exit strategies for farmers, because not only will that help the natural environment, it'll actually help farmers, give them options, let them jettison their low yielding acres, let that go to restoration, and they can focus on producing more efficiently, selling into the global market on bogs that have higher yielding varieties. They need money to do that, and some of that money could come from putting land into restoration and getting payments to take land out of production. We looked at that situation a couple of years ago. Ben Hoekstra, who worked with me and then worked at the Cranberry station, and we did an analysis of the current state of the industry in terms of which bogs are likely to go to restoration. And what we found, I think, was pretty interesting. We mapped all the bog types, right? The flow-throughs, the wetlands, and the modern renovated new bogs, right? And we came up with the following numbers. We said, okay, 20% of all the bogs in Mass are flow-through bogs, right? No one's going to invest in them. They're going to restoration. 35% are traditional bogs. Some of them might be renovated, but some of them will likely go to restoration. And 45% had already been either newly renovated with new varieties or squared off and built out of the uplands. Those aren't going anywhere. But the future really looks a lot like a lot of land will go to restoration. And we mapped this out. We said, okay, 2,600 acres of current bogs. Remember, this is bog acres, and then there's all the adjacent natural uplands around a lot of these areas. So that's a fair amount of land. A lot in this medium potential category can go to restoration, and some will stay in acres. So now out of the sort of 14,000 acres in Massachusetts, maybe in 15 years, there'll be half that. Well, what happens to the land that isn't going to be farmed? And that's really what I'm what I'm sure you want to hear about. I think there are two routes to the future, right? One, so this is 40 whatever percent of the current productive area, current crop area, going to some kind of restoration, right? So one option is it just gets retired, and then it goes on its own, right? And it regrows in whatever it's going to regrow into, right? There's also now, a lot of pressure to put solar on farms. And it can be lucrative for people getting out of the business, like putting solar on some units and using that money to plow back into upgrading operations on others. But the other option is active restoration. That is, undo the legacy of farming, right? Farming comes with legacies, right? In terms of changes to soils, changes to hydrology, things that matter for the plant communities that develop on these sites over time. So active restoration is designed to sort of undo some of those legacies and create the conditions that would result in a more natural sort of wetland environment, or a variety of environments, or in fact, we can have options to shape this in ways that further multiple ecosystem services and biodiversity goals. So I want to talk about our work on these two pathways, right? The one pathway is what happens if you just retire land, and what happens if you do active restoration on land. I want to compare them, talk about them, and sort of think about what the future holds and what options we might have for restoration, biodiversity protection. All right, so I just talk about how we do this. This is a site that's sort of been retired. This is a site that was actively restored, so I'm going to talk about sort of those two situations. We typically go out and we measure plant community composition using 3x3 meter quadrats instead of point transects. These quadrats are fairly large. We usually try to use a lot of them. We can do this fairly quickly, fairly efficiently. We identify all the plants in these quadrats, and then we sort of identify the life. We can classify these plants sort of any way we want, but the sort of typical things we do, and I'll show you, is their life form, their trees, shrubs, graminoids, which are sedges, rushes, and grasses, and forbs, all the wildflowers and non-grass-like plants. Classify them as to native or non-native origin. In Massachusetts, we use the sort of Kalina and Co-Botany Haynes classification from Native Plant Trust. And then we sort of look at their wetland indicator status. The thinking being that, maybe under one set of conditions, things trend mostly toward upland vegetation, and in the other situation, they trend most towards wetlands. And so we want to know that. We want to know what the makeup of the community is. And of course, we can track all the species and sort of figure out what's going on with species, right? All right. So first, I'm going to talk about the patterns and trends that we found with passive, what I'm going to call passive restoration. That is bog retirement with no other action. All right, this was our suite of sites. We identified these from historic maps and from some DER's layers that they had compiled. This is just the red is all the active bogs. So this is where bogs are, or this is where the industry is in Massachusetts, right? It's centered in Carver, Mass, where Ocean Spray is. And then it's been on the Cape, but there's much more retirement of bogs on the Cape earlier than there was in southeastern Mass, mostly because the cost of production, because it's far from the processing plants and the land is so valuable for other things, namely house lots, that a lot of this land has been retired. So we identified these retired bogs that were either some bogs were still active. That was kind of our starting point for the patterns, the trend in our what we call a chrono sequence. And then we had young bogs retired 1 to 9 years, 10 to 20, 20 to 49, and then 50 plus years retired. So we had some sites that were old, and we had several bogs in each category, which allows us to sort of substitute space today for time since retirement and look at the patterns over time. All right, so I'm just going to show you a few graphs of what we found that sort of summarize those broad patterns and then kind of give you a little bit of insight into what the plant communities look like and what the players are. All right, so these are the age classes. This is just looking at species richness. One thing that's very apparent in these, looking at these, tromping around these retired bogs is no matter where you are, the plant communities are very highly dominated by native plants and not non-native plants. And think of the difference between, an abandoned farm, which is a cranberry farm, and an abandoned farm, which was like a cornfield or a squash field in Massachusetts, or a strawberry field in Falmouth for that matter, which are just overrun with non-native species. These on their own, retired, these become native species rich plots of land and almost universally. I can give you some insight into what we think the reason for that is. But cranberries, A, it's a perennial, and B, it's an ericaceous shrub, and it does well in low pH. So these sites are maintained, not only they're maintained with periodic flooding, they're maintained very sandy, fairly low nutrients. They're not fertilized with large amounts of fertilizer. They are fertilized. But they're maintained at low pH. So I think all of those things contribute to the pattern that we see. You just don't see a lot of sort of upland weeds coming into cranberry bogs. So if you look at what dominates the floras in these, it's forbs in the early years, right? Forbs and graminoids, and then sort of over time, shrubs increase. This is just the richness of species. So a few shrubs come in. And a few, lots of poison ivy is a big feature, and lots of vines, rubus vines, and things like that. Love these sites. Those are all native species. And then, if you look at what happens in the early over time, you get a lot of wetland plants, but then the sort of diversity declines over the long haul. It partly declines because tree cover increases. And if you look at the sort of the cover, that was richness, those previous graphs. This is cover, and I'm just going to walk you through a couple of these. This is like cranberry cover starts high and goes down, disappears by 50 years. Native plant cover goes up. Non-native cover doesn't do much. Sort of forb and graminoid cover increase. and then sort of again decline. What really happens is sort of tree cover and shrub cover increase over time. And when canopy closes in these sites about 20 years, right? And so you get a lot of wetland dominated plants coming in that like the light and sort of the moisture of the ditches and all those kinds of things early on. But if you look over the long haul, they're really dominated by facultative species that grow things that can grow under lots of conditions. And they're not dominated by wetland dependent or wetland obligate species. And they have a fair amount of cover of upland species. Now, like pitch pine is an important one. And so if you look at sort of what the patterns of these plants are, you see this. They're just over and over again in these age classes of bogs that we visited. It starts out predominantly cranberry. Those sort of decline over time. You get large influxes of things like woolgrass, Scirpus cyprinus. You get switchgrass, Panicum virgatum. These are really very common early colonizers of these bogs. You get a lot of sort of forbs that are common in these sort of more coastal areas, like this is Euthymia caroliniana, one of the flat-top goldenrods. A lot of poison ivy, a lot of Rubus hispidus, a lot of Rubus flagellaris. In some cases, that makes up the predominant cover, but not everywhere. And then you get, colonization by a lot of grasses. This one on the left is Andropogon glomeratus. Then you've got Andropogon virginicum. And then sometimes some shrubs, Aronia floribunda, the purple chokeberry, the hybrid chokeberry. It seems to be we run into all the time on these bogs that sort of have been retired. So you get this pattern. You can map it out. I'm not going to show you the kind of multivariate analyses we've done, but they march from cranberries to a sort of a panicum woolgrass, association, out to more of the vines and rubus, and then sort of finally the resting point, it seems like after 50 plus years, very consistently on these retired but not actively managed bogs, is you end up with a lot of pitch pine. Remember, well, I guess I'll explain in a second to sort of one of the features of cranberry farming is the application of sand. Cranberry plants are, they evolved in dunes. They're used to getting covered. The more they get covered with sand layers, the more fruit they produce. So growers deposit a centimeter or two of sand every couple of years. And that encourages the growth of the upright vines that produce the fruit. But as a result, you end up with an environment that's quite unlike the original wetland, because you might, in an older system, you might have a half a meter or a meter of sand that was deposited by farming. So ends up being not a bad place for pitch pine with all that sand. And so the net result is sort of very much consistently across these older sites. Pitch pine, clethra, sweet pepper bush in the understory, that really takes off after a couple of decades, and then a lot of red maple. So if you look at sort of where things are going over time, it's becoming a red maple forest, right? And not necessarily an extremely wet red maple forest. So basal area and canopy cover of trees go up over time. And then, if you look at what those species are, this is, you end up at the end, the trees sort of, especially around 30 years, really take off. Red maple comes in and in these older age classes dominate what you see. And they're there in the beginning. It just takes them a long time to really sort of dominate the site. So that's important from a global change point of view in one way. So we're interested in, okay, what ecosystem services can these sites provide, even if they are not actively restored, they're just passively sort of retired. So we mapped out in all these sites, we measured soil carbon and soil nitrogen, but the carbon is the most important thing here, and in soils and in above ground vegetation. And because soil carbon really sort of takes off after about 20 some odd years, starts increasing quite rapidly, the combination of increased soil carbon and increased tree carbon above ground sort of makes these sites store sort of more carbon per year than, say, the forest at Harvard Forest, which is sort of measured from canopy CO2 exchange towers. So, quite important, but in the grand scheme of things for natural climate solutions, they cover relatively small areas, but they are storing more carbon because you get that above and the below ground piece. The above ground piece is more important in the early years. The soil carbon storage really takes off in the later years. But you end up with a forest that isn't that dissimilar, really, from a lot of the forests of the sort of moister end of the forest gradient for southeastern Massachusetts. All right, so let's talk about active restoration and how it contrasts with what you get if you just retire and do what I'm calling passive restoration. Here's what's under this cranberry bog. This is Tidmarsh before the restoration. You have this layer of sand. You generally, on an old swamp or old wetland, you have a layer of peat. It's often a meter, half a meter to a meter down. Usually there's all this sand from farming. You have glacial deposits underneath here, but typically it's the peat that the growers use to hold water, right? Peat is impermeable to water for the most part. So you leave that peat layer there, you put sand on top, and it makes that's what makes a place to grow cranberries. So restoration involves sort of undoing this legacy, filling ditches. That raises the water table, which is good if you want wetlands rather than sort of uplands that support pitch pine. You probably have to dig down to remove sand in a lot of places. So this is a sort of a big excavation operation involved in this. And then when it's actually done, you have scraped off the mat of the perennial cranberries. You have scooped up and at least flipped over or often removed a lot of sand. And you also, in some cases, in a lot of these, if there's a river channel, especially if there's a channel that, say, supports anadromous fish like herring or eels or something like that, you do some habitat improvements in the channel itself. You put some woody debris on the surface. You create microtopography, that is variations in elevation. I want to talk about sort of why this it ends up being particularly important. But you don't do much seeding. Maybe you seed the banks of the river a little bit, you seed where the old roads were, but really you rely on the natural seed bank to result in for the regeneration of plants. All right, and this is what you get within a few weeks after you move the machines out of there. And so what I'm talking about in these active restoration sites is what comes from the natural seed bank, not in those very small seeded areas, and how that develops over time. This is kind of what it looks like. This is the Coonamessett River in Falmouth. This is the site where we have done the best so far before and after study of what vegetation was and what it's turning into with active restoration. All right, so here's what I'm going to show, sort of similar graphs, and then I'm going to compare it to the passive restoration trajectory. All right, so here's what we've got. This is going to be part of Sarah Kleonsky's thesis. It's work we started in 2017. She's kind of taking it over and sort of working on telling the story from it. This is mean species richness. This is how many species in a 3x3 meter plot on average. This is, so we started with about 12, 13 species per plot. And then the first year this was restored, the machines pulled out in May of 2018. We studied this in August, September of 2018, 2019, 2020. We just did it in 2021, but we don't have the data worked up. So a big increase in species richness per plot. And this is like 33 species per 3x3 meter plot. That's rich. Very high plant diversity immediately. And it looks like it's declining. It'd be interesting to see where we end up with this year. I bet it hasn't changed too much since 2020, but it looks like there's a big shift in species composition from what it was, which was those plants, largely those plants I just showed you, to something new, which hangs around for a couple of years. And then sort of, I think it's settling down into something for the longer haul that it may be kind of more stable over time. Certainly a peak right after this disturbance-driven peak, right? And this sort of disturbance diversity idea, which I think holds very true in these situations. If you compare this is the graph I just showed, right? This is the active restoration. This was the mean species diversity, sort of with passive restoration. So in the age classes, sort of out 10 to 20 years, this is sort of 10 years old was this site. This was our starting point, right? But so you take that maximum diversity sort of as almost your minimum over here and ramp it up to very high plant diversity in these active restoration sites. And this is the only one where we have now sort of 5 total years of data. We're working on Childs and Foothills in Plymouth, which were just finished this year. And so we did year 1 after restoration at those sites this year. But this is the longest record. It's the longest and best record we have. All right. This is just sort of the wetland species. Now, so if you're interested in making wetlands, how are we doing on wetland species? This is the starting point, right? We had the same number of wetland species as a 10-year-old bog. Coonamessett was about 10 years old when they started the restoration. Wetland species increased dramatically, but like the total species just sort of look like they're leveling off or maybe going down a little bit from their peak. But you end up with sort of double or more the amount of wetland dependent species richness in the actively restored sites, right? And then, here's the question: the timescales here are very different. Right? This is 3 or 4 years post restoration. This is decades post restoration. So we end up with a lot of shrubs and trees here, fewer shrubs and fewer forbs and graminoids over time. Here we're still high in the graminoids, high in the forbs. Shrubs are there. They're in some cases, we want trees along the river in these cases for shade and fisheries and all kinds of things. But so how different will these be years out? We don't really know the answer to that. We know they're very different in the early years. We know we have ramped up diversity significantly, but we don't necessarily know what they're going to look like, decades down the line. Right. So here, I just want to say, why are these sites so different in terms of the diversity? Why is diversity so high? What's in the active restoration that isn't in the passive restoration sites? And the answer is it's a lot of stuff that germinates from that seed bank that is very typical of, sort of comes in on mud flats. These were all from buried seeds. These were not things we saw in the retired bogs. Things you might be able to find them, but they certainly were at a much lower cover and abundance. And these are things, especially Juncus canadensis. That is a major feature in every newly renovated, actively restored bog that we've seen. Things like Cyperus dentatus, Cyperus strigosus, some of the flat sedges. Those are very common in the early years. They're very abundant, and then these are part of that decline. They're not stick around, but they're not as abundant, sort of 3 or 4 years hence. A lot of things germinate on those mud flats. These are we get a lot of hypericums. We get this is Hypericum canadense. This is Hypericum mutilum. This is Viola lanceolata. This is a major feature in some retired bogs, but really a major feature in Coonamessett. It was in the spring. You could see white everywhere in the spring, the first few years, because you got this germinating from the seed bank. These sort of plants you don't see very much, but then became major features of the flora. We get a lot of things that are more typical perennials that come in and do stick around. Things like Symphyiotrichum novibelgii. This is a marsh fern. This is another one of the flat top coulter. This is Euthymia graminifolia. Both the euthamias are common in both the restored and the retired situations. But then you get the plants that really do stick around. The wetland obligate plants that come in, occupy a little bit of space in the first couple of years, but then kind of expand. And these tend to be Juncus effusus, Carex florida. This is Schenoplexus tavernae montani, three square rush, and or 3 square sedge, I guess. It used to be a scirpus. And then so some of the more traditional wetland plants are there as well. They don't we don't tend to see acres and acres of cattail, but we do see cattail in the wetter spots, and then things like sparganium, and then things like Ludwigia palustris, which is in the wetter spots. And one of the things that the microtopography does is it creates this juxtaposition on the scale of a couple of meters. You've got, sparganium sitting next to the flat, the euthamias. And so you get this very high diversity at a very small spatial scale because of this microtopography is created at a small spatial scale. And I think that was a sort of a brainchild of Alex Hackman in these first projects, but it works in a way because I think, that some of the mudflat species are decline in cover over some years, but if you have this microtopography, low spots that are almost always intercepting the water table and high spots that are almost always dry, no matter what a rainfall year does, and no matter what climate change does with higher or lower rainfall, summer droughts, you've created a topography in an environment where that diversity, I think, will persist over time because you've got that gradient of conditions. So Sarah's working on this in greater detail, looking at the relationship between elevation and species composition in more detail than we can do in a 3x3 because we get everything, the highs and the lows in one quadrat. So what we're doing is looking at this sort of grand average. I think there's a lot we can learn about how to do this and maybe how this actually maintains diversity over time. And then we get some great stuff like sundews, Drosera intermedia. We get Sisyrinchium atlanticum here. We get the swamp milkweed, Asclepias incarnata, and so it's kind of cool. These don't cover large areas, but we find a lot of these things. Not a lot of listed species, but a lot of things that are very habitat specific. And so we really have created the habitat for a lot of these species. And if you look at I was asking Bob a few months ago, like, okay, our record number of species in a 3x3 meter quadrat is 53. That's really high. We had an average for the whole site in Lower Coonamessett of 33 or 34 species per 3x3. Now that's on par with some of these really diverse plant communities in the world, like the Fynbos in South Africa, the Cape in South Africa, these Eastern European grasslands that have this remarkably, ridiculously high, diversity at the kind of a 1 meter scale. And so we're working on kind of, telling stories about, well, how diverse are these compared with some of these other like super diverse plant communities? They're way more diverse than almost all North American prairies at that scale. Rainforests are way more diverse, not at the 1 meter scale, but at the kilometers scale. But at this scale, you really created a ton of plant diversity. And I like to think about, well, is this a new plant community for Massachusetts? Here's these assemblages in both the retired bogs and the actively restored bogs are kind of interesting, and sort of how do they compare with these other communities, and if they persist over time. Yes, they're created by people, but so are a lot of the other grasslands, sampling grasslands and things that we care about. But how do they compare with some of the other more diverse plant communities that we have in New England? And I think they're right up there, and that's kind of interesting and part of the success story, right? So we still have a lot to learn. We really don't know what these sites will look like over time. We have a lot to learn about what practices the best increase plant diversity, like how much microtopography. And then there's this issue of, we want to do a lot of these sites, and there are now 20 plus projects on the list. We've done 6. How do you do it more cheaply? And it's a lot of big machines and a lot of it costs money to do these. So can we do them more economically with less machining, and how do we do that? And then this other idea that has bubbled up, and Bob Warner's contributed to this in a major way, is can we think about creating other kinds of habitats that are uncommon and important, but not very widespread within these projects? And I'm thinking, can we make some of the area of these into sampling grasslands? They already have very much sandplain grassland species around the edges. Can we make these kind of swale or gradient, intermittently flooded habitats that have a lot of rare species? And the answer is probably yes. We have to experiment with it. But I think DER is very much open to that experimentation. And we've got a couple projects now that are designed with some grasslands going into them. And hopefully we can work out some testing of these other ideas and begin to be a little more sophisticated about sort of what we can build into these projects, because some of them are hundreds of acres big, and that affords an opportunity that we haven't had, and it's a once in a lifetime opportunity that we need to take advantage of. All right, so I want to talk just sort of finish up here by talking about other aspects of ecosystem resilience. So I focused here on biodiversity, specifically plant biodiversity, but there are other important aspects of ecosystem resilience that are accomplished, I think, by these projects. So the one that that I've worked on for the longest and done the most work on outside of the plants is the Coonamessett River. And this is a water, a river flow record from the Coonamessett River. Guess when they stopped farming cranberries? Right here. When the river stopped going dry because the farmers were putting boards in the river and taking the water and then releasing the water in these giant spikes right after they held it, they release it, they hold it, they release it. So you've got a very unnatural hydrology. When farming went away on the Coonamessett, the hydrology got a lot more natural. You stopped getting these giant water releases when they were unflooding bogs, releasing and dropping the water level when they were flooding bogs. They did a restoration here, and I had a water level gauge at the Linda Deegan and I had a water level gauge at the lower end of the Coonamessett River. There was a water control structure, the last one at tide water, basically, sort of downstream, just downstream of this gauge. And when we put the gauge in after the bulldozers left, and all of a sudden we started seeing these giant flows that were the equivalent of like 100-year floods in the river. We knew it didn't rain. We knew it did. What it was spring tides, king tides, and these were some March nor'easters coming in, water piling up through the estuary, but now having a relief valve into these new wetlands that they didn't have before. So if you're thinking about how to build coastal resilience, open up the connections to upland, sort of inland wetlands. The pulses of water, it's mostly not salt water. The pulses of water will do absolutely no harm, and it will do a lot of good by alleviating the downstream flooding and not forcing water to pile up at the narrow heads of these estuaries where they're surrounded by expensive houses. So build in some resilience. Another way that they contribute to resilience is, we all know the coast has a major nitrogen water pollution problem, right? It's coming from nitrogen that seeps into the ground, mostly from septic systems, but also from acid deposition and lawn fertilizers and other things. And it travels in the groundwater and comes out in rivers and estuaries. Well, if you look at the Coonamessett River, this is the nitrogen concentration in the Coonamessett River going from the head of the Coonamessett, 0 at the pond outlet, down to the last station at salt water. Lo and behold, when you get to a certain point, just inland of the heads of the great ponds, there's a huge outpouring of groundwater, right? And that's where all the nitrogen accumulated from the watershed is coming out, right? Big increase in nitrate concentration. This is really low, very good water quality. This is pretty lousy water quality, right? Where are the restored wetlands? On the Coonamessett, they are right at the point in the lower river where that groundwater is coming out. So we do not know, and we have not yet done enough work to make the case that, to say that these newly made wetlands, restored wetlands, are absorbing X kilograms of nitrogen from the groundwater, because it's complicated. Some of the water is going under the wetlands, some of it may be going through. It's a detailed problem, but the idea is these have an enormous potential to act as, to provide a co-benefit, a natural climate solution that is doing multiple things. And at the price of every house you put on a sewer system to reduce this nitrogen going into the estuary, costs you $30,000 to $50,000, every house. So if you can take out the nitrogen equivalent of sewering 100 or 200 houses, you've more than paid for that restoration in terms of, you know, a couple $1 million that it costs to do a restoration like this. So this is a really important question. DER knows it's an important question. It's not the simplest question to answer, but it's really, really important one. And I think a great example of a natural climate solution and a co-benefit of this kind of wetland restoration that DER is doing on these kinds of sites. I think the last thing I want to talk about is, you know, sea level is not going to stay where it is in the future. It is rising. So we need to think about places to build salt marsh inland of where it is today. And some of these sites are like this one. This is in South Dartmouth. This is Ocean View Farm near Allen's Pond. This is, you know, basically salt water and salt marsh. One of the places you could build salt marshes is on these old farm fields that are, you know, sort of go down with water. And Buzzards Bay Coalition, Mass Audubon, other groups are putting a lot of effort into thinking about land preservation in those places where this kind of adaptation can happen. But up here, just above salt water, there are a lot of bogs. These are not bogs that you can make a living on much in the future. They are prime candidates for more restoration. And, you know, this is just a view of the South Shore of Falmouth, but this is the Coonamessett. This is the Childs River that Bob showed a picture of that was just done. There are more of these in the landscape. You know, we could make resilient landscapes by replicating what we've learned and what has been done on a few of these sites over more sites across. There's some on the Cape, there are quite a few. There's some in Plymouth. And there are even a couple on at the head of Buzzards Bay. There's a whole bunch of them. So this is something, so what we learn can be applied toward yet another sort of ecosystem resilience question. That is, sort of how do you build salt marsh onto bogs, not just the fresh marshes I've been talking about. Very important question, and something, one of the next things I think we want to tackle with these projects that DER is doing. And then the last thing I just want to say is, to make all this happen, we need people, right? We need people to get behind it. And just the story of the Coonamessett is an interesting one, because in 2003, I was the person who stood up at Falmouth Town Meeting and argued that we should not be growing cranberries on town land anymore. And we won a vote. We filed a citizen petition. We won a vote to undo cranberry farming on these town lands along the Coonamessett. 6 months later, the town voted to undo the vote. And then 6 months after that, they voted again to do some restoration as a demonstration project. That demonstration project has now turned into the whole of the Coonamessett River because it was so successful. So we've gone from what we were calling cranberry wars in Falmouth over whether or not we were going to do this, to having all of these partners' names on the sign and the clamoring to get more organizations and more names on more signs. So the tide has turned on the public support for these kinds of projects because we've done a few that were successful. So part of the mission, I think, as scientists who care about putting science into action, is really doing the work that shows that this vision can be done. People will get on board. People love these restoration sites. Tidmarsh is one of Mass Audubon's most visited sanctuaries already. The Coonamessett is loaded with people at all hours of the day, walking around these bogs, crossing these beautiful wooden bridges that they built in as part of the project. So part of the project is to do what's right for plants, do what's right for the sort of fish and ecosystem services. But part of these projects is just doing the right thing for people, doing them so that people can get behind them, explaining them to people, and being able to translate that into doing more. And if we can divert some of this infrastructure money that may be coming from Washington, who knows what's happening on an hourly basis right now. But these are shovel ready, and this is a really, really good investment. All right, I'm going to end there. Take questions. Thank you very, very much.
I thought it was an exciting talk because it combines some hardcore botany, which is a lot of what a lot of us like, with these very positive approaches to things that are exciting, initiatives that are really going to be really valuable in the upcoming time period with climate change, and especially sea level rise, which is going to strongly affect Massachusetts, and especially the areas where Chris is working. I'm going to start off with a really basic question from my own question box here, and then I'll go to Carol's question next, and then whatever questions come in. And my question is, where does Atlantic white cedar fit into either the passive or the active restorations? And you can talk about it. I'd like you to address it sort of in a specific, well, in a broad sense, and then there's maybe specific sense if there are any like problems with it, or if it's a good thing, or if it is occurring somewhere but not others. So why don't we start with that?
Yeah, sure. No, that's a good question. So, Bob, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So yeah, I kind of left Atlantic white cedar out of that because of the site I was focusing on here in the Coonamessett and in our long chrono sequence. It wasn't a major feature, but it is part of these projects now, and I think part of that is driven by big success in establishment of Atlantic white cedar at the Eel River restoration site, which was completed in 2010. And we just resurveyed it in this year. And we have been working with Alex Hackman on analyzing a data set that is focused specifically on Atlantic white cedar. But the short story was they planted thousands of Atlantic white cedar there. They fenced them off to prevent deer grazing, but I think the biggest challenge was grazing by small mammals, by voles. There was a lot of mortality in the first years, but about half the cedars have survived since planting, and the ones that have survived are doing great. And beginning in 2016, 5 years ago, but exploded in the 2020 sampling. There's tremendous reproduction of Atlantic white cedar, and this will be an Atlantic white cedar swamp years out. There's no question. It will be enormously successful at that. And one of the feedbacks that's needed in that is it takes a while for enough sphagnum to develop at these sites. It has to be wet enough, and of course there are gradients and there are hummocks and mounds and troughs. But what we saw in surveying this for reproduction in 2020 was that there are certain places where reproduction is just astoundingly high, and it has to do with having that seed bed of the sphagnum at the right elevation and moisture. And I think I couldn't tell you exactly how to design that. What I would say is let's design these with gradients of moisture, plant some white cedar, across the gradient, and you will have success at some parts of this gradient depending on what the water level does. So we're writing that up as a manuscript. It was a great success story, and the reproduction really sort of kicked in 5 years hence, 5 years post restoration. So there's a big effort now to plant at least some Atlantic white cedar. There's some in the Coonamessett, there are quite a few in the Childs, there's some all over Tidmarsh, sort of to replicate this. But none of those is 5 years old yet. So but the ones in the Eel River are spectacular. And so if you want to visit this site, I highly recommend it. There's a lovely little parking area off Long Pond Road in Plymouth. You walk in, you have to walk all the way sort of into the headwaters where most of the cedar is. And it feels like you're in Boreal Canada. It's remarkably distant from things, a wonderful, wonderful site. And you'll see these sort of 15-foot high cedars now that were planted as 16-inch sprouts in 2010. So I think it can be a part of this. There are a couple other sites on the drawing board, including that one in Freetown, what they're now calling the Millbrook bog sites owned by Mass Wildlife, where there are cedar swamps adjacent, and having Atlantic white cedar, invited in by the restoration activity from the places where it already is, I think could lead to expansion of this habitat and and I think it could easily be successful, and I think it is and should be parts of those project designs. I see somebody corrected my Spinoplectus. Yeah, you're right. It was Tabermund, Taber, or whatever it is what used to be soft stem bulrush. I think this one was 3 square. Right? So yeah, it's pungent. Right. Yeah.
Yep.
I should have written the species names at the bottom, but I didn't. I was trying to show off, and it didn't work.
Everything else looked good though. So if you only had that one correction, I think you're doing pretty well. Great. Yeah, that it's really interesting about Atlantic white cedar. And I can second what you just said about Eel River, because I walked in there this year and it's a fabulous site, and the path is very, very nice. So I do encourage people to check that out. There were in the early parts of that stretch, there's actually a good band of wild rice in there.
Yeah, really big stand of wild rice. Yeah, it's really cool. Yeah, it's easily 10 feet tall.
Yeah. So now a question from Caro. She was interested in the slide about the really high diversity communities that you compared your restoration projects to, and wondering if those had also received kind of a high level of disturbance, or how much disturbance they had received. And sort of, I think the question is in part about the intermediate disturbance hypothesis.
I honestly don't have a great answer to that question. They received less disturbance than these sites I was just talking about, where they were sort of 1-2 years out from a major scraping and exposing of mud. But there's some disturbance over time, but much less. Some of it's grazing, some of it's sort of fire. A lot of it in those grasslands, I think, is grazing.
Yeah.
I did my PhD dissertation in Manitoba on prairie wetlands, and one of the features of these prairie wetlands is they go through these wet-dry cycles. And during the wet phases, wetland plants, this is soft stem bulrush and cattails, and they make a lot of seeds, and they put seeds out and they stay in the seed bank for decades off, and then the mature plants often die out or get very thin, and then the water level recedes because there's several dry years in a row, and that moist soil mud flat is the site of germination of all these things. But the diversity is actually relatively low. It's a few dominant plants, white top, a couple of scirpuses, what used to be scirpuses, and this is a different kettle of fish. This is quite diverse in terms of what's there. Those of course are high pH, very fast growing plants, very good at crowding out other things. This is a little bit different. So much higher diversity than some of these other sites where the disturbance sort of is what drives the diversity over time, because at any one time there might, in any phase of that cycle, there might be 2 or 3 plots per 3 square meter, 2 or 3 species per square meter, but then over time you get the diversity. But so I don't know enough about these European grasslands. Just was a sort of an interesting thing that sort of piqued my interest, and so I think Sarah and Anna and I are going to sort of explore sort of where these fit in the grand scheme of these kinds of habitats, and sort of what drives them. And much more diverse than a lot of at that scale than some North American prairies, where you might have sort of 20 or 25 species rather than 35 species.
Yeah. I think another aspect that's impressive is, along with the high diversity, is a very low cover or abundance of non-native species, whereas in a lot of restorations, in a lot of published papers, they see an increase in diversity, but a good chunk of that is either non-natives or very ephemeral annual species that are highly weedy, such as ragweed, both ragweed, which are of course native, but not something that's going to stick around, or something that's desirable. So
no, it's true. We see very little multiflora, very little Phragmites. I don't think we have had goosestrife in any plot ever. We knotweed around the edges, and this is despite the fact that it's very little bittersweet. these things are all over the edges, but they just don't seem to effectively colonize. I worry most about Phragmites, and I worry most about the gray willow, which is the one that really seems to be very aggressively colonizing, the former bog sites, a lot of them anyway. And it's definitely there, really still small at the moment. But that's if I had to pick one to worry about, I would worry about that.
I think that's a good,
tough to control.
very good candidate for being concerned. Right. A question from Lisa: how are the active restored versus the passive restored bogs likely to compare with regard to carbon sequestration? I think you touched on that briefly, but maybe you could expand on that just a bit.
So the answer is we haven't quantified it yet. I think so. There are a couple of ways to do that. One is by sort of waiting some decades and measuring soil carbon change over time. The other is with sort of more sophisticated carbon exchange, eddy flux towers and carbon exchange, sort of real-time carbon exchange measurements. Right now, that isn't on the agenda to be able to be funded to do. I think it would be really interesting. If I had to guess, it will be higher than in the passively, sort of retired situation, mostly because I think we really can jumpstart sphagnum. We've seen it at Neill. We're seeing it at Kounoumesset, only a few years old. They're now trying to do interfluve, and some of the designs for these have like transplanting chunks of sphagnum to jumpstart it. And I think that that will be a way of increasing soil carbon storage. I think the tree regrowth will be slower than upland situation in these sites. I think because you want to keep them pretty wet. The goal is wetland plants. It is wetlands, and so I think the key is to get the soil carbon sequestration going. And I think it can be quite high because it's very good growing conditions. And once sphagnum gets going, I think that sequestration can be high. But that's just a guess, and we haven't measured it. But we really should be. We're one of our goals in sampling all these sites. We're just working with Alex Hackman and Jess Cohen at DER to sample all of the sites of their 20. We've done the ones that have been done to get pre-samples so that we could go back, or someone could go back in some years and look at the change in soil properties and soil carbon storage.
Yeah, that's great. If anyone else has another question, please go ahead and type it into the chat. I'm going to ask another one here to give us a little time in case you have a question. With regard to the measurements of the diversity of the plots, have you considered using the floristic quality assessment or FQ, the floristic quality index system of seeing how the so-called coefficient of conservatism changes over time in these plots? This was recently redone. The ranking system for all the plants, all the native plants, was recently redone, organized by NatureServe, and they did it instead of by like state or county or whatever, New England. They did it by ecoregion. So there's one specific for ecoregion 84, which is the one you're working in primarily, and there's systems online where you can just enter your species list into these, and they'll pop out the FQI as a result for it. Have you considered doing it?
Yeah.
Something that?
Yeah, no, I think Sarah and I have talked about it, and I think that would be it wouldn't be hard for us to do, really. It relies on those judgments for, and the more specific they are for the region you're in, the better. But I'm happy to hear there's, that this has been updated, and I think we could do that. We were, our priority, literally our priority in the last 6 months has been to sort of make sure that Sarah was getting the data she needs to be able to do these. She's working on Kounoumesset, Childs, and Foothills, where we have large numbers of plant plots. And the other thing we've done is we've done the sort of species area relationships, and we have because we have 40 plots, we can in Lower Coonamessett and in each of these sites, we can look at sort of, well, where do you max out on species? So it turns out that with very consistently, it looks like with 40 plots in one bog unit, we get 90% of the species that we're likely to encounter. And with 10 plots, we get 2/3, 66, 67%. So we kind of know where we stand in terms of, and we've been doing kind of walk around surveys of these sites, keeping lists of things that, only for the platforms, not so much we're excluding the roads, but so I think we're doing, when we go, we do either 10 plots or 40 plots. With 40, we get 90%. With 10, we're getting 2/3 of the species I think we're likely to encounter. So, and we just got back from doing Windswept on Wednesday and Thursday last year. Windswept is this really wonderful site on Nantucket. And we're comparing the Nantucket conservation folks are doing plant surveys there, and they're using point intercept transects, and we lined up our quadrats on their point intercept transects, and now we're going to have this wonderful data set to compare the methods in this habitat. So if they go forward with monitoring, or if we need to compare one method versus the other, we're going to have this very rigorous comparison of our method versus their method, and so which one is better at capturing the less common species and sort of estimating cover. I think they're going to line up pretty well, actually.
Wow, that sounds like a really great test of those two processes.
They're great partners out there. Well, we can only do it because they've got so much work on the ground.
Well, yeah, I think I'll sort of close this section out by talking about that partnership. Chris and I have been engaged in a broader coalition, excuse me, with some of those folks on Nantucket and people in Long Island and the rest, Nature Conservancy in Massachusetts, something called the Sandplain Grassland Network. And if you type into your browser Sandplain Grassland Network, or let's see, what's the URL is sandplaingrassland.net. We've been working at it for at least 5 years, maybe 6. And it's an effort to reach a greater understanding of the sandplain systems, and also figure out some of these same restoration issues on sandplain grasslands as well, like we've been hearing about the Cranberry Bogs restoration. Thanks again, Chris, very, very much for a terrific talk tonight.
You're very welcome.